Everything dies. You know that. I know that. The bacterium knows it. The tree knows it. The elephant knows it. You are born, you grow, you age, you fall apart, and you die. That is the deal. That is the arrangement. Physics says so. The second law of thermodynamics, the most ironclad, unchallengeable, unforgiving law in all of nature, says that disorder always increases. Everything runs down, everything decays, every structure, no matter how magnificent, will eventually crumble into dust. Stars die, galaxies dissolve. The universe itself is winding down like a clock with nobody left to wind it. So of course you die, of course I die, of course everything that breathes and moves and thinks must at last stop. That is completely wrong, and I can prove it. Not with some fancy philosophical argument, not with wishful thinking, or religion, or poetry, though all of those have had a go at the problem. No, with an animal, a real living observable animal that you can hold on the tip of your pinky finger, an animal that looked the second law of thermodynamics right in the face and said, "No, thank you. I think I'll go the other way." And the infuriating thing, the beautiful thing, is that it's been doing this quietly in the ocean for longer than we've had the brains to notice. We built pyramids and wrote symphonies and split the atom, and the whole time this creature was floating 6 inches under the waves, doing the one thing we were absolutely certain couldn't be done. But before I show you this creature, I want to make sure you really feel the weight of the problem. Because if you don't understand why death seems unavoidable, you won't appreciate just how astonishing it is that something has found a way around it. I want you to feel it in your bones. I want you to be so convinced that death is mandatory that when I introduce the exception, it hits you like a punch. So let's start with physics. Let's start with what we think we know. You are an arrangement, that's all. You're an incredibly sophisticated, staggeringly complex arrangement of atoms. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, a smattering of phosphorus and sulfur, a few trace metals. Nothing special about the ingredients. You could find them in dirt. You could find them in the air. What makes you alive is not what you're made of, but how it's put together. The pattern, the organization, the fact that these atoms are not scattered randomly in a pile, but are woven into proteins and membranes and double helices and little molecular machines that pump and twist and fold and copy with a precision that would make any watchmaker weep with envy. Now, the second law of thermodynamics is essentially a statement about patterns. It says that in any closed system, the amount of disorder, what we call entropy, tends to increase over time. Things fall apart more easily than they come together. You can shuffle a deck of cards 1,000,000 times and you'll never accidentally get them back in perfect order. You can drop a coffee cup and it shatters into 100 pieces, but you will never see 100 pieces of ceramic leap off the floor and reassemble into a cup. The arrow only goes one way. Disorder increases, order decreases. That's the law. And it's not a weak law. It's not a suggestion. It's not like a speed limit that people occasionally ignore. Arthur Eddington, the great English astrophysicist, once said something I love. He said, if someone points out to you that your pet theory of the universe is in disagreement with Maxwell's equations, then so much the worse for Maxwell's equations. If it's found to be contradicted by observation, well, these experimentalists do bungle things sometimes, but if your theory is found to be against the second law of thermodynamics, I can give you no hope. There is nothing for it but to collapse in deepest humiliation. That's how certain we all were. That's how certain we all were. The second law is why your car engine produces waste heat. It's why a glass of hot water always cools down to room temperature and never heats up by itself. It's why every fire eventually goes out. It's why when you break an egg, you can't unbreak it. At least, not without doing an enormous amount of work that generates even more disorder somewhere else. The universe has a very clear preference, and the preference is for mess. Erwin Schrödinger, brilliant man, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, asked a wonderful question in 1943. He gave a series of lectures in Dublin, and he asked very simply, what is life? And part of his answer was this striking idea. He said a living organism maintains its organization, its exquisite low entropy state, by continually feeding on what he called negative entropy from its environment. It drinks orderliness. A living creature takes in food, which is structured, organized matter, extracts the order from it, and dumps the waste, the high entropy leftovers, back into the environment. That's how you stay alive. You are an entropy pump. You suck in order and spit out disorder. And as long as you can keep doing that, you persist. You maintain your improbable pattern against the relentless tide of the second law. Beautiful idea. And it's correct as far as it goes. But here's the trouble. Even the best pump eventually wears out. Even the most exquisite machine accumulates damage over time. And that brings us to the real question. Not why do we live, but why do we stop? Let me tell you about your cells. You are made of roughly 37 trillion of them, give or take a few trillion, and every single one carries a copy of your genetic instructions, your DNA, coiled up inside the nucleus. When a cell needs to divide, it has to copy all of that DNA, every base pair, the whole enormous manuscript, billions of letters long, and the molecular machinery that does the copying is remarkably good. But it has a problem. At the ends of your chromosomes, there are these repeating sequences of DNA called telomeres. Think of them like the plastic caps on the ends of shoelaces. They don't carry any useful genetic information themselves. They're just protective buffers. And here's the trouble. Every time a cell copies its DNA to divide, the copying machinery can't quite reach the very end of the molecule. It's a geometric problem, really. The enzyme that does the copying needs to grab onto the strand a little way in from the tip, which means the last little bit doesn't get copied. So every time a cell divides, the telomeres get a tiny bit shorter. A tiny bit of the protective cap is lost. Now, for a while, this doesn't matter. The telomeres are long enough that losing a little each time is no big deal. But after enough divisions, about 40 to 60 for most human cells, the telomeres have gotten so short that they can no longer protect the chromosome properly. And at that point, the cell receives a signal, a very firm signal that says, stop dividing, you're done. The cell enters what we call senescence. It's still alive, still metabolically active, but it can't divide anymore. It sits there doing its job less and less well, accumulating damage, leaking inflammatory molecules into the surrounding tissue. A man named Leonard Hayflick figured this out in 1961, working at the Wistar Institute in Philadelphia. Before Hayflick, there was a kind of dogma in biology that cells were immortal. A famous surgeon named Alexis Carrel claimed in 1912 that he'd kept chicken heart cells alive and dividing in a dish for decades. Everybody believed him. He'd won a Nobel Prize after all. Who's going to argue with a Nobel Prize winner? Well, Hayflick argued. He noticed that his own cultures of normal human cells always stopped dividing after a certain number of passages. Always, no matter how carefully he prepared them, no matter how perfect the conditions. And he was brave enough to say, maybe the cells aren't failing because of something I'm doing wrong. Maybe they're failing because that's what they're supposed to do. He published his findings. People were skeptical. It took what he later described as 10 or 15 painful years for the scientific community to accept what he'd discovered. Torpedoing a half-century of belief is not easy, even in science. But he was right, and that maximum number of divisions, about 50, is now called the Hayflick limit, in his honor. In 1971, a Russian theorist named Alexei Olovnikov proposed that the mechanism behind the Hayflick limit might have something to do with the ends of the chromosomes. He couldn't copy the very tips, he argued, and so information was being lost with each division. And then in 1984, Elizabeth Blackburn and Carol Greider discovered telomerase, the enzyme that rebuilds telomerase, and the whole picture snapped into focus. They eventually won the Nobel Prize for it in 2009. The Hayflick limit, telomere shortening, telomerase, it was all connected. It was a molecular clock counting down the divisions until your cells give up and retire. So here's the picture. Your cells have a built-in countdown, a fuse, if you like. And every time they divide, the fuse gets a little shorter. Eventually it runs out. The cells stop renewing themselves. Tissues degrade, organs falter, you age, you die. And this isn't just human cells. The Galapagos tortoise, which can live 120 years, has cells that can divide many more times than ours before hitting the limit. A mouse, which lives about 3 years, hits the limit much sooner. The number of divisions correlates with the lifespan of the species. Evolution has tuned the clock differently for different animals. But every animal has a clock. Now you might say, wait a minute, can't the cell just rebuild the telomeres? Wait, add back what was lost. And the answer is yes, actually. There is an enzyme called telomerase that can extend telomerase, rebuild the protective caps. And some of your cells do have it. Stem cells have some telomerase activity. Immune cells can activate it. But here's the sinister part. Do you know what else is very active telomerase? Cancer cells. Cancer cells have figured out how to keep their telomerase long, which is exactly how they achieve their terrible gift of dividing without limit. They're immortal in the worst possible way. So evolution seems to have struck a bargain. You can either have cells that eventually stop dividing, which protects you from cancer but means you'll age and die, or you can have cells that never stop dividing, which means cancer will eat you alive. Pick your poison, death by aging or death by cancer. The telomere system is essentially an anti-cancer mechanism that has the unfortunate side effect of making you mortal. And on top of all that, there's oxidative damage. Every time your mitochondria, those little power plants inside each cell, burn fuel to make energy, they produce reactive oxygen species, what people sometimes call free radicals. Tiny molecular shrapnel that bounces around inside your cells, nicking your DNA, damaging your proteins, oxidizing your membranes. It's like running a factory that produces excellent products but also sprays sparks everywhere. Some of those sparks hit things you'd rather they didn't. Your body has repair systems, antioxidant defenses, proofreading enzymes. Teams of molecular mechanics constantly patrolling, fixing the damage, clearing out the debris. And they're very good, astonishingly good actually. But they're not perfect. Over time, mistakes accumulate. Damage that doesn't get fixed piles up, proteins get cross-linked and stiff, DNA mutations build up in cell after cell. The pattern, that is, you gets noisier and noisier, like a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy. Each generation of copies a little less sharp than the last, and eventually the noise overwhelms the signal. Denham Harman proposed this idea back in 1956, what became known as the free radical theory of aging. It's been refined and complicated since then, and it's not the whole story. But the basic insight is sound. You are being damaged from the inside by the very machinery that keeps you alive. The engine that runs you is also slowly destroying you. There's a kind of tragic poetry in that if you're inclined to see it. So there it is. The physics says disorder increases. The biology says your cells have a timer. The chemistry says damage accumulates. Death is not just likely, it's inevitable. It's built into the fundamental architecture of what you are. You can eat well, exercise, take your vitamins, avoid smoking, get enough sleep, but in the end, the second law seems undefeated. It always wins, except there's this jellyfish. In the early 1980s, two young scientists, a German named Christian Sommer and an Italian named Giorgio Bavistrello, were doing field work in the Mediterranean. They were collecting hydrozoans, which are tiny, delicate members of the jellyfish family. Small stuff. The kind of work where you wade around with glass jars and a pair of very patient eyes. They collected some specimens of a species called Turritopsis, brought them back to the lab, put them in a jar, and waited for them to grow. Now, the normal jellyfish life cycle goes like this. You start as a larva, a tiny swimming thing called a planula. The planula settles on the ocean floor and grows into a polyp, which is a little stork-like creature attached to a rock or a shell. The polyp then buds off free-swimming jellyfish called medusae, which is the bell-shaped form you'd recognize. The medusa grows up, reproduces, and dies. Larva, polyp, medusa, death. One way, one direction, just like everything else in the universe. But when Sommer and Bavistrello checked their jar, they found something that shouldn't have happened. Instead of maturing and dying like sensible jellyfish, some of the medusae had fallen to the bottom of the jar and turned back into polyps. Adult jellyfish had reverted to their juvenile form. That's like a butterfly turning back into a caterpillar. That's like a frog ungrowing into a tadpole. That's like me turning back into a baby. That is not supposed to happen. The arrow of development, like the arrow of time, like the arrow of entropy, is supposed to go in one direction. They stared at those polyps, they checked and rechecked. They looked for contamination, they wondered if somehow new larvae had gotten into the jar. But no. The animals were the same, the DNA was the same. The adult had become a juvenile. Development had gone backward. It took a while for the scientific community to pay attention. The discovery was presented at a workshop on hydrozoans in Italy. A marine zoologist named Stefano Pirino was there, and he later recalled the astonishment in the room. He called it counter-evidence against the fundamental dogma of biology that lives go in one direction, from fertilization of the eggs to death. Counter-evidence is a polite word. In plainer language, what they were looking at should have been as impossible as a scrambled egg unscrambling itself. And for a long time, not many people noticed. It was a niche finding in a niche field. Hydrozoan biology isn't exactly front-page news. But slowly, steadily, the implications began to sink in. The species was eventually classified as Turritopsis dohrnii, and the press gave it an irresistible nickname, the immortal jellyfish. Let me describe this animal to you, because it matters that you understand how small and how modest it is. Fully grown, Turritopsis dohrnii is about 4.5 millimeters across. Oh, smaller than a pencil eraser. Smaller than the nail on your little finger. It's translucent, almost invisible in the water, with a bright red stomach showing through its bell like a tiny glowing heart. It has maybe 8 to 90 tentacles, depending on where in the world it lives. Tropical ones have fewer. Temperate ones have more. No brain, no lungs, no dedicated organs for what it does. It is by any reasonable measure among the simplest animals on Earth, and it does something that nothing else in the animal kingdom can do. When this jellyfish encounters stress, injury, starvation, disease, or even just old age, it can reverse its entire developmental program. The adult medusa sinks to the bottom and begins to transform. Its cells undergo a process called transdifferentiation. This is the key word, so let me make sure you understand what it means. In a normal organism, cells are specialists. You have muscle cells, and nerve cells, and skin cells, and liver cells. Once a cell has been assigned its job, it's committed. A muscle cell doesn't become a nerve cell. A skin cell doesn't become a blood cell. That's the basic rule of development. Cells differentiate, they specialize, and they stay specialized. That's the deal. Transdifferentiation breaks the deal. In Turritopsis dohrnii, adult specialized cells can transform directly into completely different types of specialized cells. A muscle cell can become a nerve cell. A nerve cell can become a skin cell. It's not that the cells go back to some undifferentiated stem cell state and then respecialize. No, they jump directly from one identity to another. It's as if a plumber could on a moment's notice become an electrician, not by going back to trade school, but by simply deciding to be one and having all the knowledge instantly. And through this process, the adult jellyfish, with all its mature specialized tissues, reorganizes itself back into a polyp, a juvenile. It has effectively rewound its own biological clock, and from that polyp, new jellyfish will eventually bud and grow, genetically identical to the original, the same animal, reborn, not a copy, not offspring, the same individual, starting over. A Japanese scientist named Shun Kubota at Kyoto University managed to keep a colony of these animals alive in his laboratory for an extended period, something extremely difficult to do. These are finicky creatures. You have to inspect them every single day. You have to make sure they've properly digested their food, tiny brine shrimp cysts. The water conditions have to be just right. Almost nobody else has managed it. But Kubota did. And he reported that during a 2-year span, the colony reversed itself 11 times. 11 times, falling back, growing up again, falling back, growing up again, over and over. Theoretically, there is no limit to how many times this can happen. And the resilience is extraordinary. Researchers have tried starving these animals. They've heated them, they've exposed them to ultraviolet light. They've cut them with instruments, insults that would kill virtually any other animal, and the jellyfish simply shrugs, sinks to the bottom, and starts the reversal process. One researcher described it by saying, even if you starve it, bring it to 100 degrees Celsius, cut it, or use ultraviolet light, things that would normally kill an animal, it doesn't die. It just resets. Now I want to be very careful and very honest about what this means and what it doesn't mean. Turritopsis dohrnii is not indestructible. It is not invincible. These are tiny, fragile animals that get eaten by fish, by sea turtles, by sea slugs, by practically anything with a mouth. In the wild, most of them die the old-fashioned way long before they ever get a chance to use their rejuvenation trick. Being biologically immortal doesn't mean you can't be killed. It means there's no internal clock that makes you die. If nothing from the outside world destroyed you, you could in principle go on indefinitely. And that's a very different thing. Think of it this way. A candle flame doesn't have a built-in lifespan. As long as you keep feeding it fuel and oxygen, and as long as nothing blows it out, the flame will persist. It doesn't age, it doesn't get old. But of course a puff of wind will extinguish it in an instant. That's the situation of this jellyfish. No internal expiration date, but absolutely vulnerable to external danger. So what does this mean for our physics? Does the immortal jellyfish violate the second law of thermodynamics? No, absolutely not. And the fact that it doesn't is what makes the whole thing so interesting. Remember, the second law says that entropy increases in a closed system, But no living organism is a closed system. You are an open system. You take in energy and matter from your environment, you do work with it, and you dump waste back out. As long as there's a flow of usable energy coming in, you can maintain your low entropy state, your organized pattern, at the expense of increasing entropy somewhere else. The sun pours low entropy light energy onto the earth. Plants capture it. Animals eat the plants. At every step, the total entropy of the universe goes up as the second law demands. But locally, right here, right now, inside this organism, things can get more ordered. What Schrödinger said in 1944 was exactly right. And life feeds on negative entropy. Life drinks orderliness from its environment. And as long as the drink keeps coming, the organism can persist. The question was never whether the second law allows biological immortality. The question was whether any organism had evolved the machinery to actually achieve it. Whether any living thing had figured out how to reset its own internal clock, repair its accumulated damage, and start fresh. And the answer, astonishingly, is yes. At least one has. But why just one? Or, well, almost just one. There are a couple of close relatives, other Turritopsis species, that show some ability to reverse, but they lose the trick after they reach sexual maturity. Their reversal rate drops to almost nothing. Only Turritopsis dohrnii keeps the ability at full strength throughout its entire life. Only this one species, out of all the animals on Earth, can do it reliably at any age. Why? That's where the physics meets the biology, and it gets really interesting. Because the answer seems to lie in the specific genetic toolkit this particular species has assembled. The process of transdifferentiation that Turritopsis uses requires an extraordinary degree of cellular flexibility. Every cell has to be able to change its fundamental identity. That means the genetic program inside the cell, all those switches that tell it you're a muscle cell or you're a nerve cell, have to be reversible. The cell has to be able to erase its current instructions and rewrite new ones. It's an enormous ask. In most animals, those switches are one way. Once they're flipped, the cell can't go back. In 2022, a team of researchers led by Maria Pascual Turner published a landmark study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. They compared the complete genome of Turritopsis dohrnii with a closely related species called Turritopsis rubra, which looks similar, lives in similar waters, but cannot rejuvenate after reaching maturity. The comparison was revelatory. What they found was not one simple difference, not a single immortality gene, but a whole suite of enhancements. The immortal jellyfish had more copies of genes involved in DNA repair. Think of it as having extra mechanics in the garage, always ready to fix things. It had variants of genes associated with better telomere maintenance, meaning it could counteract the very shortening process that enforces the Hayflick limit in our cells. It had expanded families of genes related to oxidative stress response, meaning it was better at mopping up those damaging free radicals I mentioned earlier. Its garbage collection system, if you like, was more efficient. And during the reversal process itself, the researchers found something remarkable in the gene expression patterns. Genes that are normally silenced in adult cells, genes associated with what's called the polycomb repressive complex 2, were being turned off. And pluripotency genes, the genes that give embryonic stem cells their magical ability to become any kind of cell, were being turned on. The cell was being actively reprogrammed to a more youthful, more flexible state. It wasn't just patching damage, it was rebooting the whole operating system. This jellyfish has essentially evolved solutions to every problem I described. The telomere problem, it resets them. The accumulated damage problem, it has enhanced repair. The cell specialization problem, it can undo it. It's as if someone looked at every mechanism that causes aging and systematically found a workaround for each one. Now here's what I find genuinely wonderful about this. It tells us something deep about the nature of aging itself. Aging is not a law of physics. Aging is not required by the second law of thermodynamics. Aging is a biological phenomenon, a consequence of the particular engineering solutions that evolution happened upon in building complex organisms. It's a design choice, not a physical necessity. Let me say that again because it's important. Nothing in the laws of physics says you have to get old and die. The second law says entropy increases, yes. But it doesn't say you can't repair yourself fast enough to stay ahead of the damage. It doesn't say you can't rebuild your telomeres. It doesn't say you can't reprogram your cells. The laws of physics set the playing field. But how the game is played, that's biology. That's evolution, that's engineering. And evolution, being the blind tinkerer that it is, simply found it more useful in most lineages to have organisms that age and die and make room for the next generation. Death is not a physical inevitability, it's an evolutionary strategy. A very common one, a very effective one, but a strategy nonetheless, not a law. This little jellyfish, floating silently through the world's oceans, smaller than your thumbnail, brainless and humble, is a living proof of that fact. It demonstrates that the molecular machinery for biological immortality exists, that it's possible, that the laws of physics permit it. The question is not, can it be done, because something is already doing it. The question becomes, could it ever be done with something as complicated as a human being? And here we should be very sober, very cautious. A jellyfish has maybe a few thousand cells. You have 37 trillion. A jellyfish has no brain, no complex nervous system, no intricate immune system with its delicate balances. The complexity of a human body is orders of magnitude beyond what Turritopsis has to deal with. Rewinding a jellyfish is like erasing a sketch on a napkin and drawing a new one. Rewinding a human would be like dismantling a city and rebuilding it from the blueprints with everyone still living in it while you do it. But the research has already revealed some remarkable things. The genes involved in the jellyfish's rejuvenation, the DNA repair genes, the telomere maintenance genes, the pluripotency genes, are not unique to jellyfish. We have versions of them too. They're ancient. They're conserved across enormous evolutionary distances. Cynodarians, the group that includes jellyfish and corals and sea anemones, split off from our lineage something like 600 million years ago. And yet the genetic toolkit for cellular reprogramming is recognizable in both. The tools are in our genome, they're just not turned on in the right way, at the right time, in the right combination. Think about that. The instructions for resetting a cell, for making an old cell young again, are written in your DNA right now. They're sitting there silent like a song nobody's singing. In the jellyfish, those instructions get activated when the animal is in trouble. In you and me, they stay quiet. Evolution decided, for reasons that made excellent sense at the time, to keep those switches locked down in complex organisms like us. Because, as I mentioned, the same kind of cellular plasticity that would let you reverse aging could also, if it went wrong, give you cancer. The two things, immortality and malignancy, are uncomfortably close to each other. They're two sides of the same coin. This is what excites the researchers working on this. Maria Pia Miguelera at Texas A&M University, one of the world's foremost experts on this species, has pointed out that the immortal jellyfish can accomplish its reversal in less than 24 hours. The entire organism, every cell, reprogrammed in a single day. No brain directing the process, no nervous system coordinating it, just the cells themselves following ancient instructions written in their DNA. Understanding how cells can reprogram themselves to become something else that is needed, she has said, is at the base of regenerative medicine. And this jellyfish does it faster and more completely than anything else we know. And one of the most striking observations is that the jellyfish retains its original DNA throughout the entire process. The polyps that grow from the reversed medusa and the new jellyfish that eventually bud from those polyps are genetically identical to the original animal. It's not reproduction, it's not cloning, it's the same individual starting its life cycle over, which, if you think about it, raises a philosophical question that would keep you up at night. If every cell in the animal is replaced but the genetic blueprint is the same, is it the same animal? Is identity carried by the atoms or by the pattern? I like to think it's the pattern, but I don't know. Nobody does. What I do know is this. For centuries, we physicists and biologists and philosophers have all accepted without much argument that death is baked into the fabric of reality, that it's as fundamental as gravity or the speed of light, that it's a price of admission to the universe. And then along comes this tiny, translucent, barely visible speck of jelly drifting through the Mediterranean, and it says, actually, no, I have another way. It doesn't violate physics, it uses physics. It takes that flow of energy from the environment, that negative entropy Schrödinger talked about, and it uses it not just to survive, but to reverse the process of aging itself. It rewinds the tape, it goes backward, not the arrow of time, mind you. Time still flows forward for the jellyfish. But the arrow of development, the arrow of biological aging, that arrow turns around, and somehow in this one lineage, evolution figured out how to make that work. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, this is all very lovely, Feynman, but when do I get to live forever? And the answer is, I don't know. Maybe never. Maybe the gap between a jellyfish and a human being is just too vast. Maybe the complexity of our bodies makes this kind of wholesale reprogramming forever impossible. Or maybe in 50 years or 100 years, some brilliant young scientist will figure out how to turn on the right genes at the right time and give us something like what this jellyfish has. I don't know, and I'm suspicious of anyone who claims they do know. What I do know, and what I think is worth sitting with, is the following. The universe is not as hostile to life as we thought. The second law of thermodynamics does not sentence you to death. It sentences you to a constant struggle against disorder, yes. But that's a fight you can win, at least locally, at least temporarily. And temporarily might mean a very, very long time, if you're clever about it. The immortal jellyfish has been spreading around the world, by the way. It's a remarkable story in itself. In the early 2000s, Maria Pia Miglietta, then a graduate student at Duke University, started collecting Turritopsis specimens as a side project during her travels studying hydrozoans. She grew up on the Italian coast, playing in the same waters where the animal was first described back in 1883. Over time, she began finding it everywhere. Spain, Japan, the southeast coast of the United States, both coasts of Panama, the Indian River Lagoon, in Florida. It was the same species, genetically almost identical across all these far-flung populations. And she realized what had happened. The jellyfish had been hitching rides on the hulls of ships, stowing away in ballast water, and surviving the long voyages across open ocean. Any other jellyfish would have died during the crossing. This one just reversed itself and waited. It was a silent invasion spreading across every ocean, and nobody had noticed. The animal is so small, so translucent, so unassuming, that its global colonization happened completely under the radar. Miglietta's work brought it to public attention, and then the media frenzy began. Immortality, invasion, biological impossibility, the buzzwords flew. But underneath the excitement, there was a real scientific puzzle. How does this animal achieve what nothing else can? Now, I want to put this in a broader context because the jellyfish is not the only living thing that challenges our assumptions about death. Single-celled organisms, for instance, don't really die of old age in the traditional sense. A bacterium splits in half. Each half grows to full size. It splits again. There's no parent that gets older and dies. There's no corpse. The original cell just becomes two cells. In a very real sense, the bacterial lineage is immortal. The cell that exists today is a direct, unbroken continuation of a cell that existed billions of years ago. Your very own cells, in fact, are descendants of a lineage that stretches back to the origin of life on this planet. That original spark of life never died. It just kept dividing, kept branching, kept transforming. You are a temporary arrangement of matter within an unbroken thread of life that has persisted for something like 3.8 billion years. So in a way, death was invented. It's a newcomer. Multicellular organisms invented death as part of a package deal. When cells started cooperating to build complex bodies, they agreed to a division of labor. Some cells would become the germline, the eggs and sperm, the lineage that would persist into the next generation. And the rest, the soma, the body cells, would do all the hard work of living, breathing, moving, thinking, and then die. The body is disposable. The germline is eternal. That's the deal that multicellular life struck with evolution. You sacrifice the individual for the benefit of the lineage. And this deal has been phenomenally successful. It gave rise to fish and amphibians and reptiles and mammals and birds and you and me and Beethoven and Einstein and everyone you've ever loved. But it is a deal. It's an arrangement. It's not a law of physics. It's a biological strategy. And the immortal jellyfish is proof that the deal can be renegotiated. I want to go back to the physics one more time because I think there's a lesson here that goes beyond jellyfish and beyond aging. It's a lesson about how we think, about the mistakes physicists make when we get too comfortable with our own laws. We physicists like our laws. We like things that are absolute, universal, inviolable. And the second law of thermodynamics is about as close to an inviolable law as you'll find. Eddington made his famous proclamation. Boltzmann spent his whole life working out the statistical foundations. It's real, it's solid, it works. But the second law tells you about the statistical behavior of large numbers of particles. It tells you about the overwhelming probability that disorder will increase. It doesn't tell you about every single possible arrangement. It doesn't forbid local decreases in entropy. It doesn't say you can't build a cathedral. It doesn't say you can't grow a baby from a single fertilized egg into a 7-pound miracle of organized complexity. It says the universe as a whole is running down. But within that running down universe, remarkable things can happen. Islands of order can persist, can grow, can become more elaborate, as long as they're paying for it by increasing disorder somewhere else. And this is actually one of the most beautiful things about the second law, the thing that people often miss. The law doesn't forbid order. It makes order interesting. If everything were naturally orderly, if crystals formed themselves into perfect structures without any effort, if proteins folded without any cost, there would be nothing special about being alive. It's precisely because organization is costly, because you have to fight for it, because it requires a continuous investment of energy and attention, that a living organism is such a spectacle. A flame is beautiful, a river is beautiful, but they're just energy doing what energy does when you let it flow downhill. A living cell is energy doing something extraordinary. It's energy organized against the flow, it's energy pushing uphill. Not forever, but for now. And that's enough. Life is one of those islands of uphill energy, and biological immortality is simply an island that has figured out how to stay an island for a lot longer than usual. It's not a miracle, it's not magic, it's physics, doing exactly what physics does. The surprise is not that the jellyfish is possible. The surprise is that we ever thought it wasn't. So what do we really learn from Turritopsis dohrnii? We learn that death is not a law, it's a habit. A very old, very widespread, very successful habit. But a habit, not a commandment. We learn that the machinery for reversing biological aging exists in nature. It's real, it works. It's been working for a very long time in complete silence. We learn that the second law of thermodynamics is more subtle than we sometimes give it credit for. It doesn't forbid order. It just demands that order be paid for. And if you can keep paying, you can keep ordering. We learn something humbling about evolution. We tend to think of complexity as progress. We think bigger brains are better. We think humans are at the top of the tree, the most advanced, the most successful, the crown of creation. But evolution is not a ladder, it's a bush. And on one branch of that bush, a tiny, brainless animal evolved the solution to the problem that confounds every philosopher, every physician, every physicist on Earth. It just did it differently than we expected. Not by building bigger, more complex repair systems. Not by thinking its way out of the problem. By going backward. By becoming simple again. By unmaking itself and starting over. There's a lesson in that for scientists. We are trained to look for progress, for advancement, for forward motion. We instinctively equate advanced with complex and primitive with simple. And sometimes that's right, but sometimes nature solves the hardest problems by going the other direction entirely, by simplifying, by retreating, by finding that the way forward is actually the way back. Statisticians have calculated that if human beings were biologically immortal, if there were no aging, no internal countdown, if the only way you could die were from accidents, diseases, and violence, the average lifespan would be somewhere around 600 to 700 years, just from the baseline risk of accidents and mishaps, which means that if you took away aging but changed nothing else, you'd still eventually trip on a rock, get struck by lightning, or eat something that disagreed with you. Death would still happen, just not on a schedule. That puts our situation in a curious light. We're not doomed by the universe. We're doomed by our own engineering. The machine we're built from has planned obsolescence, and somewhere in the ocean there's a machine no bigger than a pencil point that doesn't, and we learn, which I think is the deepest lesson of all, that the universe is more imaginative than we are. Every time we decide something is impossible, every time we declare that nature cannot do something because of this law or that principle, some humble creature somewhere turns out to have been doing it all along, patiently, quietly, without the slightest interest in our pronouncements. The bee that shouldn't be able to fly according to the oversimplified aerodynamics of a previous generation, the shrimp that punches with the force of a bullet, the tardigrade that survives in the vacuum of space, and now the jellyfish that refuses to die. Nature is not bound by our imagination. It is not limited by what we think is possible. It does what it does, and it's up to us to figure out why. There's a man in Japan, Shin Kubota, who has spent years tending his colony of immortal jellyfish. He's so enchanted by them that he's written songs about them. He sings these songs at the end of his scientific presentations. Now, some people find that amusing, but I think he's onto something. I think that when you're in the presence of something this astonishing, this beautiful, something that challenges what you thought was the most basic fact of existence, the appropriate response is not a shrug, it's a song. The animal that proves death is not inevitable, is not a mighty predator or a towering tree. It's a blob of jelly, no bigger than the head of a pin, and it's everywhere. It's in every warm ocean on Earth, drifting on currents, clinging to the bottoms of boats, reversing its age whenever it gets into trouble, starting over again and again and again. So here's what I'd like you to think about. Not whether humans will ever achieve biological immortality. That's a question for the future, and I don't trust predictions about the future. Think about this instead. For all of human history, we have believed that death is written into the laws of the universe, that it is as inescapable as gravity. And a jellyfish, a brainless, heartless, spineless, almost invisible speck of ocean life, has quietly demonstrated that this belief is wrong. Not wrong in principle, wrong in fact. Something is already doing what we thought couldn't be done. What else are we wrong about? What other doors have we declared locked that are in fact standing wide open? What else is sitting out there in nature, doing the impossible, waiting for us to notice? That's the kind of question that keeps a physicist going. The idea that the next surprise might be swimming right past you and you just haven't looked closely enough. Tell me, what do you make of it? If death is not a physical necessity but an evolutionary strategy, does that change how you think about being alive?